measures. It involves quite a bit of data and information collection. It includes baseline field data. It includes Indigenous knowledge. That's a major component of it. Indigenous knowledge is something that is featured in virtually every aspect of an environmental assessment and basically is involved in almost every study. Mm-hmm. And then consultation input is a huge part of this. Public consultation, stakeholder consultation, Indigenous community consultation. This occurs at many points through the environmental assessment process, and of course included in that is the terms of reference or ToR process as well. So just to give you an example of when I talk about potential impacts and mitigation measures, just to give you a better idea of that, example might be flooding or fish passage at culverts, at water crossings. So one of those mitigation techniques might be to ensure that the culvert's designed properly and sized properly to be able to accommodate the volume of water that is modeled to flow through there. And then another example might be dust from the construction process by using dust control methods, watering roads, etc. So if we move on now to the next slide, technical team there, we're on the Ontario EA process slide. In a nutshell, the Ontario EA process consists of two major phases, and I'm just going to talk sort of at a high level about this. We'll talk in more detail as time goes on, but the first phase is the terms of reference phase or the planning phase. The terms of reference is essentially the work plan for the EA, and Michael and Qasim will be talking in a little bit more detail about that. And then once that's complete, there's the actual environmental assessment phase, which is the doing of the environmental assessment. So it's conducting those baseline studies that have been outlined in the ToR and specified in the ToR. So the ToR describes what you're going to do. The EA is the actual execution of what you're going to do. So the one thing I want to mention about this EA process is that consultation and engagement with Indigenous communities and other stakeholders occurs throughout this entire process, as I mentioned before. So it's during the ToR process, it's during the EA process as well, at many different points. And then the ToR itself, as I mentioned, forms the overall EA work plan, and that ToR process, as we'll learn more about, is done with input from the public, from the stakeholders, from the Indigenous communities as well. So it is a document that changes with time based on input received from other stakeholders. So if we look now at the Ontario ToR process flowchart, while this looks very confusing, it really isn't once you start working through it, and it makes a lot of sense once you sort of work your way through it. So it starts with the notice of commencement of the terms of reference, and so that's a public notice indicating that this process is beginning. Then it moves to the preparation of the draft terms of reference. There is an opportunity for public input, that draft terms of reference, and then there's a submission of there's a notice of the draft terms of reference for review, more public input, then there's a notice of submission of the ToR, and once the final ToR is prepared, and then it goes to the MECP for their review and comments, and then the MECP prepares recommendations for the minister, the MECP minister, and then they render a decision. So that's a very high level, quick version of that. And I'm going to hand it over now to Mike to talk about the EA process in a little bit more detail.
Welcome, everybody. So if the ToR is approved, right, I think we talked about this on our radio show, all the milestones associated with the terms of reference, which is the work plan, for the environmental assessment. And if the ToR is approved, then there's this notice of commencement for the EA. So there's typically 6 steps associated with that. Once the field studies are done and all the studies within the work plan is done, then you sort of do this draft EA, they call it, right? Prepare a draft EA following the approved terms of reference. So the Indigenous communities, the public, the stakeholders, government ministries, agencies review the draft EA and so it's a process of public engagement, public input. And once that's incorporated, then you submit a final EA, which is step 2, to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks for review. And again, it's another review process where Indigenous communities, agencies, the public, the stakeholders, and government ministries review the EA. So there's actually 2 different public inputs, public review engagement process, where these drafts get floated out. Everybody gets to take a look at it and comment, and it gets back in, gets incorporated, and goes floated out again to the public for public review. And then the proponent, in this case, would be Webakwe and Martin Falls First Nations, will meet with the government to discuss the EA, in this case the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And then based on that would be step 5, which is the step of the decision, whether the minister will approve, reject, or ask for more work to be done on the EA. So some cases the EA is, they think there has to be a bit more work in certain areas, and they say, before we make a decision, go out and do a bit more work on this, on A, B, or C. But if it's approved, and then there's commitments to be made. There's actions from that decision that follow, and that's to monitor. So if the project is implemented, the obligation on the project proponent to monitor the environment for a period of time to see if the predicted impacts actually occurred, and if the EA commitments are being fulfilled. So for those that don't know, it's not just once you get the approval, good, let's get this project going. There's actually commitments that gets monitored by the agency or sort of the ministry to see if those commitments are actually being fulfilled. So back to the EA terms of reference. So again, we're trying to give you a highlight of the ToR, and then what happens after the ToR, which I just explained, is the environmental process, the EA process.
That's right. That was the big picture, right?
Yeah.
Given the big picture now.
So we're still in the ToR process. We're just started. You saw the notice of commencement for the ToR last month. You can find that on our website. So what are the EA terms of reference? But the terms of reference document is basically a work plan for the environmental assessment. That's why I mention work plan all the time, because it's your plan. All the different plans you're going to go out there to do the environmental assessment, actually study the water, study the wildlife, study all kinds. We'll show you a couple of slides at the end. It also describes what's going to be done in order to understand any of the impacts on the environment. So in this case, the natural environment, the cultural environment, the social environment, as well as the economic environment. And what's key on this terms of reference is your input. Like your comments are so important because they help determine what will be done during the EA. So that's why that public engagement and public input is key to all this. So if you go to slide 7, the next one, Ontario's participation opportunities. So we mentioned before about key milestones And so you know, the first one was last month. It was basically the starting point, the notice of commencement of the terms of reference. And it sounds so fancy, but but really it's just notifying the public that you're embarking on drafting a terms of reference, on drafting a work plan, which basically describes the project. The terms of reference describes the project, its rationale, its location. There's typically a map, consultation opportunities, and project contacts. So that's in the notice of commencement. You can find that again at our website at northernroadlink.ca, and it can be downloaded and looked at. So all those elements I just mentioned will be there. The next public participation opportunities, that includes Indigenous communities, trying to make that note, is the draft ToR. So the draft ToR is the next phase. There will be the next public notice. We're not there yet. We just got the first public notice on the notice commencement, but it will take several months, you know, to draft up, to do a draft ToR with public input and feedback, and put it out there. So that's the next milestone in the ToR phase. The final milestone in the ToR phase is the final ToR. So once the draft ToR is done, we receive the feedback, and we incorporate all that feedback into the terms of reference, and that becomes our final ToR that we submit to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. So that's the ToR phase. If it gets approved, remember, like just because you submit a final ToR doesn't mean it's going to be approved. The minister has to make a decision whether it's technically complete. You know, there's all kinds of elements that they have to consider whether the ToR should go forward. If it's approved, and then there's going to be in the EA stage called the notice of commencement and environmental assessment. So notice commencement of the ToR, draft ToR, final ToR. If it gets approved, then all of a sudden there's a notice of commencement environmental assessment, and so the work begins. And then once that work, the field work is done, you know, all the surveys are completed, and then they do a draft EA report, and that becomes another opportunity for review and feedback. And then the last stage of the EA for public participation is the final EA on that. So that's the participation opportunities. And I'll pass it on to Qasim, I believe. Qasim, are you there? Can you?
Michael, can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. I can hear you.
Perfect. Great. Sorry about that. You know, it's just in times like today with remote means, we're bound to do a little bit of troubleshooting. So, so thank you for bearing with us. I was discussing the different stages within the ToR, the different activities that we undertake at this stage as a proponent. You know, for the purposes of constructing the ToR, developing the ToR, we identify project activities. What is it that the project will actually do? What are the environmental settings of the project? You know, start to develop that information. Identify potential effects of project activities in the future, as well as look at measures to minimize or prevent impacts. Now, this is all going into a ToR, which is related to the provincial environmental assessment process. Now, on the slide there, you also see the word project description, which is fairly similar to the activities we're describing in the ToR, but that's related to the federal process. As part of the federal process, the assumption is that we need to check if the federal process, the impact assessment process, is applicable on our project. And that's something we'll talk about in the future. So for today, let's focus a little bit more on the ToR itself. Now, the ToR will identify studies required to assess impacts, and all of this is done through means of consultation with communities around us and the public members who are interested in the project. So to do so, we prepare a consultation plan, and based on that consultation plan, we engage and consult with members of the public interested in the project, different government agencies, and of course, most importantly, our neighboring Indigenous communities. All of this leads us to the preparation of the project description and the ToR, which subsequently becomes available for review. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So input from the public on the draft EA ToR is essential. Without that, we can't really complete the terms of reference process. But why do we need to hear from you? What's the rationale behind it? Well, do we know everything about environmental effects at this point? Do we know everything about the land where the project may be built? No, not really. We don't. That is why we want to talk to you, and that's the point of conducting this environmental assessment. You as community members and neighbors, you know the land. You have a deep connection with the land, and you can tell us about conditions, about historical changes that we do not know about right now. So things to consider, things to think about when you start to provide your input to the project is what are the different environmental features out there that we should be aware of? What are some potential environmental impacts that concern you? But don't just think about all the bad things that can happen. I think projects, especially a project like Northern Road Link, presents such tremendous opportunities as well. So think about those opportunities as well. Think about the good things that the project potentially represents for you, particularly on the social and cultural impact side of things. Does this provide access to your traditional territory to enable you for traditional practices like hunting and gathering? That can be a potential impact. Similarly, there could be some negative cultural and social impacts that you're concerned about. We want to hear about those so that we can think about those and incorporate them into the assessment and think about mitigation, think about taking those negative impacts away from the project as much as we possibly can. And then lastly, think about economic impacts. Projects like the Northern Road Link, this is a very significant project which can create significant economic opportunities, and that could be in the supply chain for you as Indigenous business, regional, local businesses to sell your goods and services, but also for training and employment with the project. I think as we proceed, we'll talk significantly more about what that might mean in the future. Next slide, please. So as part of the process, the environmental assessment process, we try and establish baseline conditions through baseline studies. We're trying to establish what existing conditions look like today to identify the condition of the environment, what it looks like right now, today. This will give us something to compare to when looking at potential impacts of the project in the future. When we do environmental monitoring, which is after the project is complete, if we don't know what the current conditions are today, then we don't really have a sense of comparison as to what type of impacts the project is having. We also don't know if some of the methods we're using to control environmental impacts are working, if we don't have something to compare to. So baseline studies help establish baseline conditions for today, which becomes our basis for comparison in the future. So this is why conducting baseline studies and gathering as much information as we can is so essential to the process. And there's so many different types of baseline studies that are typically conducted through the environmental assessment process. They vary from project to project, location to location. Nature of the project dictates some of the studies that are conducted. But some of the typical baseline studies conducted are, if we can move to the next slide, please, include main buckets like the natural environment, physical environment, socioeconomic and cultural environment, and human environment. If I break it down a bit more within natural environment, we'd certainly be looking and studying breeding birds, marsh birds, reptiles and amphibians, aquatic habitat, vegetation, caribou, bats. Within the physical environment, we would be conducting LiDAR surveys to understand the terrain. We would be doing geotechnical drilling to understand the stability of the ground. We're studying surface water, groundwater. Those are all the areas where we want to establish baseline conditions. And then on the socioeconomic and cultural environment side, which is very important, we'd be looking at socioeconomic community conditions through surveys, community health conditions through surveys as well. And on the human health side, we'd be curious to establish what country foods are consumed by means of surveys, and we would also undertake community health surveys. Now, all of these studies are conducted from a traditional scientific perspective, but they're incomplete till we receive Indigenous knowledge associated with all of these different disciplines. And Michael spoke to that, Don spoke to that. Indigenous knowledge becomes sort of the heart of the entire process in a way. It informs all the different baseline conditions that we're trying to establish, and it helps us think about mitigation in the future. It helps us establish what are certain features that are more important for this project to consider. So this is why Indigenous knowledge also becomes quite an important component of the entire process. So I think from there, Don, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Qasim. And maybe just to follow up on what you were saying about Indigenous knowledge there, I think, and Mike, feel free to jump in on this, but more now than ever, Indigenous knowledge is being expected by both the federal and provincial regulators to be included in virtually every component, every study of the environmental assessment. It used to be, you remember, Mike, that there'd be a sort of a separate section for Indigenous knowledge, and it wasn't integrated into all of the different studies, and that's where the changes have occurred, isn't it?
Yeah, it's they call it biophysical studies, right? So there's chapters in the report, and what used to be an appendix, as a standalone in the back end of the report, they used to call it traditional studies, traditional land use, and et cetera. But it's called Indigenous knowledge these days. Now that has to be weaved into the report and all the biophysical studies in there. So just exactly what Qasim was saying, it's essentially almost like the heart of it. And I think, and I don't think that's an exaggeration at any point, especially where this project's located.
Yes.
Right, because it's just Indigenous communities around there. There's no municipalities. Like where the footprint of this is. It's all Indigenous communities. So that's going to be a central focus. I think on all these studies.
No, I totally agree, Mike. And I think by us emphasizing this, what we're trying to do is encourage those community members listening and anyone that's listening to us to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is included in this environmental assessment. It's really important that we get that knowledge, and the earlier we get it, the better. Because the more it can factor into this overall process, and that's really important. As Qasim said, it's the heart of this work, and we need to get that heart installed in this process as early as possible. Well, I think that pretty well wraps up our session. Any thoughts, Qasim? Final thoughts from you before we go?
Yeah, I really appreciate everyone joining us for this first session. This is a journey. This is the start of a process which will take us a little bit of time, and we're keen. We're really looking forward to sort of getting in touch with you, being in communities, starting those dialogues, receiving that input, that Indigenous knowledge, which will really enable us to conduct the comprehensive assessment that I know the two proponent communities, Martin Falls and Webbequay, have directed us to do. So very much looking forward to the next few months, Don.
Michael?
I would invite everybody to the website. That's northernroadlink.com or .ca. Yeah. Actually, I think it's both. in it, you'll see the notice commencement, where also a map of the project, but more importantly, you'll see videos of the two chiefs of Martin Falls and Webequie First Nations on why they're doing it. Why are they embarking on this major undertaking, and it's worthwhile going to the website just for that. So I would encourage everybody to see that, and there'll be more. That we'll have more videos, more content. It's going to be a hub for everything.
Thanks for that, Mike, and thanks to all of you for tuning in this week. We really appreciate it, and we hope you follow along this journey with us. We will be back on in 2 weeks. That'll be June 16th at 4 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Join us again. We also have a radio show every other week as well. That will be on June 16th from, what is our time slot there, Mike?
2:30.
2:30 to 3:30, a 1-hour radio show. It's a slightly different kind of format. A little bit of music involved too, so I think you'll enjoy that as well. It's a little bit less formal. And thanks again for watching, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks.
You bet.
Thank you.